All right. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself, your name, where you live and work?
I'm Christine Duvivier, and I live and work in Wellesley, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston.
Right, right. And what do you do?
Well, I am a positive change speaker, leader, and mentor.
Yeah, yeah. And what does that mean?
So it began actually in business,
Yeah.
and I began working with executives that were, first actually myself, leading positive change
Yeah.
in a very large corporation, and then ending up consulting with other executives and mentoring other executives or coaching other executives as they were trying to lead large-scale positive changes.
Yeah.
And then more recently, my research took me in the direction of looking at the next generation of leaders, which is today's students.
Yeah.
And so that's actually led me to be giving talks and actually working with either families or students as they're looking at, how they're coming through the system and where they're going.
Right, right. And what's your background for doing all of this?
I have an MBA from Cornell, so that's where I started, was in business with an MBA. And as I said, then I had a nice career in business, and I led some very large changes in business, and I loved that. That was the work that I loved. So then I decided to do that kind of work full time, which meant being a consultant, and I began doing that with other companies and with executives. And as a result of that, actually, I got asked to coach an executive who was being promoted into a new role, leading a big change in a company. And so that's what took me from there. And while I've been doing this consulting work, I went back to school for a master's in positive psychology at University of Pennsylvania.
Right, right.
And so I was bringing positive psychology into my work with businesses and with executives, and I've done that. But while I was in school, there was actually a tragedy with a boy that I know, an 18-year-old.
Right.
And so as a result of that, I threw away the research. I'd done a lot of research on business and motivation for adults. And so I threw that away. And I ended up looking at gifts and strengths in students who are not in the top of the class.
Right, right.
And that led me to define some myths about education. And because of my business background, of course, I can look at what are the possibilities for them in the future, and what does it mean in terms of real-world leadership. And what I realized was there were just these untapped gifts and strengths in kids that we kind of write off and say, they're not important. So that's led me in this new direction.
Right, right, right. And how did you get into coaching? Like, was that from doing it, like you explained, or did you take some training, or?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, I've been a coach just even of teams. So right off the bat, there was that. And I actually, like when I was a basketball coach, I got videos from John Wooden and all these like major coaches and learned from them. But I think it's something that came fairly naturally to me in the beginning. And as I said, when I was consulting with executives, sometimes, just even in a consulting engagement, you're actually kind of coaching, say, the CEO or the senior leader a little bit. But where I had the first real quote-unquote coaching assignment was in a company that I do consulting work for. The senior executive was promoting a woman into a role that was going to lead change around the world. Yeah. And he said to her, let's hire Christine to coach you on that. Yeah. So that's really how I got started.
Right, right. And so for how long would you say you've been combining coaching and positive psychology?
Well, combining coaching and real positive psychology at from the University of Pennsylvania point of view has been just over 4 years now.
Right.
But I would say that I was always oriented to what I call like the small p positive psychology, a lot longer than that. And so the consulting I've done for more than 10 years now, the positive change work I'd say I've done for probably 15 to 20 years now.
Right, 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 right. And so right now, what are the major elements of your job, like the major tasks?
So, well, there's a piece of my job where I actually go in and I work with executive teams, say on their strategy, or say when they're trying to roll out a new initiative or something. And there's different things that I do with them. I do a lot of facilitation, or I may help them. Like, for example, I might go around the world with them and engage employees in positive conversations, get the employees more committed. So that's one piece of my work that's been going on for a lot of years. Another piece is actually working with individual executives and coaching, or I call it mentoring them. And so again, that's the work that I've been doing even before I went back for positive psychology. Then the new piece of my work is I do give a lot of talks now and a lot of workshops based on my research on students in the bottom 80%. I call it Beyond the Myths of Education, and help people get a better frame of reference. And so I just get asked to give a lot of talks and workshops. And as a result of this work, sometimes I work actually directly with individual families or individual students. So that's a small piece of
right.
what I do.
And when you coach people, like, what issues do they come to you with? Like, what do they want you to help them with?
Well, it depends a lot on the individual. So in some cases, someone's being promoted or would like to be promoted or is trying to make a career change. Or is thinking about whether they even want to stay with this organization. So, or maybe their boss is saying, I'd really like you to get some help. Yeah. And so, there may be reasons like that. So the individual wants to create change. Then this would be somebody that's, say, like in a company.
Yeah.
For the students or the families, then they're usually coming to me. I told you that my research was really on kids who are not top students, but then I ended up uncovering myths about education that affect every student. So I get a mix of students. I get kids who are not in the top of the class and their parents are worried about them. But usually if people are coming to me, they're worried about their kids, but they want to know that their kids really do have gifts and strengths, and they really want their kids to know that, and they want the kids to feel better about themselves, so they'll come for that reason. Or I will also get kids who are terrific students, but they may have some anxiety or depression, or they may do well in school, but they might not really know what they want to do with their lives. I mean, that's a huge problem with adolescents and sort of 20-something kids is, I don't know what I want to do with my life. And, they think they're the only one that, I remind them that there are a lot of us as adults who don't really know that either.
Yeah. So what does it look like when people come to you for coaching? What would a coaching engagement look like? Like, how would it start?
Well, so usually people come to me, they're either referred to me or they know of me somehow. So that's how I get my clients. And they usually have some idea of why they're even seeking me out. Of course, they may ask me, well, do you do this? Can you help with that? But that's how it gets started. And
so they call you or email you?
They call me or email me, yep. And so I'll help them, talk about whatever's on their mind and what they're hoping that, together we might do. So, they might, as I said, usually, the bottom line is they want to make a decision, they want to learn to better operate in the business world, they might want to better operate in the world that they're in, be a more effective executive, or in the family world, a lot of times they're worried about how they're doing and where they're heading, and so they may want to figure out some of that.
Right. And so what happens? So they contact you, and what then happens?
Well, so if they decide that they do want to work with me, then we schedule time. Most of the time I do it by phone, occasionally, especially if somebody's local, and especially sometimes I've found with families and students, they may want a face-to-face meeting first. Executives are very comfortable working by phone, but sometimes families want to meet you face-to-face first. And if they're local, that works. Otherwise, we just do it by phone or Skype. But so from there, I don't actually follow a set process. I do have kind of a general model that I'm working off of, but I learned a long time ago, there was a guy named Ed Schein years ago, MIT. Probably, the first person that I was aware of that was really talking about change. And he said something that has really stuck with me and that seems to work with my clients. And that is, you start with where the person is or where the organization is. You start there. And then you go from there. So that's what I do. I start with where are they. And some people are ready right off the bat, let's say, to perhaps talk about strengths and gifts or something else. But then maybe that's not what's on their mind, or that's not where, for example, if I have somebody who's very depressed or very anxious, that might not be where we start the conversation. So I'll let them come in and talk with me for a bit about what's on their mind and what their questions are. And then based on that, we'll start moving.
Right. And you said you did have a general model. So what was that like?
Would you like me to show you something?
Yeah.
So, in general, what the model I'm working off of, I don't know This is probably, I don't know if you can see this or not. But so, basically the first thing I'm doing is really just helping people understand that there are hidden gifts and strengths that in the work world or in the school world, a lot of times really aren't acknowledged in any formal way. And so you will resonate with it when you see that it's something that you have within yourself.
Yeah.
But it might be something that you've never articulated, that nobody's ever articulated to you, that you don't even realize has any special value. Okay, so that's in general the starting place, but you might be somewhere else on this model, and so I might start somewhere else with you. And so, for example, if it's a family or if it's students, then in small ways, what I'm trying to do is help them understand the myths of education. So I don't usually sit there in a coaching session and say, okay, here are the myths that you need to understand. But through listening to them and questioning them, I might say, well, do you realize that a lot of people think this and that's actually a myth? And here's what my research, and so I might just share it with them that way.
Right.
Is this what you wanted to know about the model? All right, and so then another thing I'll do is help them to understand what matters most for succeeding in life. So, and this could be an executive or this could be a student, but a lot of times they think the grade or the salary or whatever, is all important. And so I'll get them thinking in a bigger frame of reference about what really is going to matter for their long-term well-being.
Yeah.
Right. And so, let's see, then stories. Okay, so, what's the story that you're telling yourself? What's the stories that your organization is telling if you're in an organization? Or what's the stories that your family is telling? Or what are the stories that you're hearing in your school? And I'll help them to understand, what are the stories that they're really listening to that are helpful to them? Yeah. And the stories that aren't as helpful to them. Yeah. And then what I dwell on, of course, is the ones that are helpful to them. Yeah. And in a session, I might, draw out of you a story that I can see is lighting you up, and then I'll play with that with you, and we'll really explore it, and we'll talk about maybe like how you could then take that story and use it somewhere else. So that's another piece of the model. One of the things that I studied in my research is I studied motivation, and Dietschy and Ryan's motivation hierarchy. So the thing that I was most interested in fact, this is what I had done a lot of research on before I threw it all away, was intrinsic motivation. Yeah. And Aristotle talks about this, and Maslow talked about this, but it really isn't out there in the way that I'd like to see it in a big way. Mm-hmm. And so I help people understand the difference between intrinsic motivation, which is a very high level of self-motivation, but might not show up in grades or might not show up in other ways because those are extrinsic measures. Yeah. And so I help them, or for example, if I have somebody depressed, I might just start with, the people are always thinking about shoulds. Yeah. I should do this. Yeah. I need to have willpower to do this. Yeah. And I'll help them focus more on wants. Yeah. Because wants are getting more at the heart of intrinsic motivation, and that's where there's a lot of power. So that's another piece of the model. Then we'll work on building positive emotion, engagement, optimism. So I'll use things to help them build optimistic thinking skills. I'll help them, I'll use resilience tools that they can then, that their brains will start using on their own, but we'll model it in a session. And of course, as you know, doing things that are engaging, helping them think about using their strengths in new ways. Also, I have a set of gifts, help them think about, how they engage, how they feel engaged using their gifts and what other ways they might do it. And then, well, so then here's where the model might differ between executives and students. So for students, then I'm looking at how can we increase their control over their own learning. Yeah. In the case of executives, the basis of control is the same, which is the one thing you can control is your own thoughts. Yeah. Yeah. And it doesn't always feel that way, but when you get right down to it, you can. Yeah. And so we'll focus on that. Like that's your locus of control. And how you can take more control over wherever you are by working with your own thoughts. And then the final piece of it is just figuring out how do you unleash that hidden talent. And, that's a back and forth. And, but that's sort of the general model.
Can you put it up in front of you? So, yeah, like that.
Like that?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
All right. And so what does it typically look like that? Do you talk about those topics, or just once in a while you talk about those topics, like in the coaching engagement, just to get the sense of?
Yeah. So I don't go through it as a specific process. We will touch on those. We'll do more than touch on them. We will go into those different areas, but I do it from a point of view of what are you saying in this session, or what am I sensing from you?
Yeah.
And then it'll come about very naturally. It's not like I'm not preaching to you,
No.
and I'm not even really teaching in the session, although there will be moments where I might share something with you to help you get a different perspective on yourself or on your situation.
Yeah.
But I don't go through a process in a sequential order, because I just have found that that may not be my particular style, but it so happens that the clients I attract aren't clients who want to go through a specific process. They want me to talk with them about what's on their mind.
Yeah.
And while they could have come in here 2 weeks ago and talked to me, about something that's happening in their career, they may come in next time and talk about something that seems slightly different. It will turn out to be interrelated.
Yeah.
But it could seem slightly different.
Right.
So I just work with where are they, and then I weave these things in as it's appropriate in the session.
And did you have a way of starting a session and a way of ending a session?
Depends on the person. And it depends also, are we in person or are we on the phone? Right. Most of my clients are on the phone. Right. So, and again, it depends if it's an adult or a child.
Yeah.
But, with adults, there's, usually just a couple of minutes of what I would call kind of warm up, just ease them into it. For me, just reconnecting, understanding what's hot on their mind at the moment, which might have nothing to do with what we're going to talk about in this session, but it might be hot on their mind. And so it's just nice for them to kind of clear the air of it. If it's a student, we'll have probably a minute at the most of that sort of warm-up kind of time. Again, it depends on the student, but a lot of students don't want to do a lot of chit-chatting with me. They want to sort of more get to what we're here for. Right. So that's how I start. And then ending, it depends again. Everything, I'm sorry, but all my answers seem to be it depends. Yeah. But depending on the client, a lot of times I'll recap. If there's something they're going to do in between our sessions, then I might recap that. A lot of times near the end of our session, I'll just check with them to see if they want another session. Yeah. Even people who have signed on and say, they want to do 10 sessions, let's say, or something, I still do a check-in with them at the end of the session. Right. So say we've been meeting on a 1-week basis or a 2-week basis, I might say to them, so would you like to schedule something again in a couple of weeks? They may want to go out a little further this time. They might want to come in a little sooner. So I leave some flexibility. And that's how I end it, is either, talking to them about where they're headed next, what they might be doing in between, just checking with them. We don't necessarily schedule a session, but I just check to see that they do want the next session. Right. And then if they're in person, then I'm walking them out. So that's the real ending. I do have one client that one day, as we were leaving, it's a female, adult female, but it's a student. And as we were leaving, something just hit me, and I said to her, I'm a person that hugs a lot, and I just said to her, could I give you a hug? And she said, I'd love that. And she said, my family hugs a lot, but her family isn't local, so she's here by herself. And so we actually end our sessions now at the very end, at the door, with a quick hug. Right. And it was something struck me about that, is that because she's in this city by herself right now, and she's new to the city, she probably doesn't have a lot of hugs in her life. And she's an adult, so she gets to decide whether and I ask her every time, but that's how we end. And it's something that she likes, and it's something that I like.
Right. Yeah. So what about assessments? Do you use assessments in your coaching?
I use a couple of assessments. Well, actually, there's 2 that I generally use, and then there's a 3rd that occasionally I use. So generally, I use the VIA, the Values in Action, Strengths Assessment. Yeah. I use that pretty much with every client. Right. Occasionally with an executive, it may be something that I wait longer to use, but I pretty much use that with every client. Yeah. And then I also identified a set of gifts that are in conflict with school. So these are actually things that are good about students, but actually make them look worse in school.
Right.
And so with students, I will generally do that assessment of gifts.
Right.
Or with families, like sometimes it's parents, it's not students.
Yeah.
That one occasionally I will also use with executives. It depends on the person.
Right.
But if I'm sensing that there is something there, and you probably know this, but a lot of adults are carrying scars from their school days, even way into very, very successful careers.
Yeah.
So sometimes I'll use it in that situation.
So the VIA and the gifts and...
The gifts. So the third one occasionally will be Myers-Briggs.
Yeah.
And usually the way I use that is I check with them to see if they've done a Myers-Briggs.
Right.
And I don't usually send them off to do it. I mean, if it's something they really want to do, then of course. But sometimes what I'll do is find out, because a lot of people have done it.
Yeah.
I mean, even students. And if they have, we might bring that into the conversation.
Right. And so how do you bring something like the VIA or the Myers-Briggs into the conversation?
Well, so VIA, what I'll do with them is... Often I'll do it in the session with them, is actually go through the VIA with them. I just find with executives, and by the way, I also use the VIA sometimes when I'm facilitating executive teams. Again, it depends, but I have used that multiple times doing that. And I find time and again that they do not want to go take a survey by themselves. They don't have time, they don't want to be bothered doing it. It's amazing to me. Like, I love taking these surveys, so I can't believe that other people don't, but they don't. So what I'll do is, in the session, we will go through it together, and they will identify some of their strengths.
Yeah.
And then we'll begin talking about how they use their strengths. One of the things I will do is, once I know their strengths, I'll keep a list of their strengths, so that as I'm in a session with them, I might start to notice, oh, there's your humor again, and so I will sort of talk about, oh, I see that you're using, but a lot of it is asking them, how do they use their strengths, how could they use their strengths, and then with the gifts, was that the other one you wanted to?
Yeah.
So with the gifts, the first thing I do is just help them to understand that they do have some gifts that are in direct conflict with what's being asked of them in school.
Yeah.
So when they come to understand that, then they start to feel a little bit better about themselves. Like, for example, I had one girl who had a lot of anxiety. She was a middle school student. And so after we went through her gifts, one of her gifts was insight.
Yeah.
And she said, I just think differently from other people. But up until the session where we talked about those gifts, she wasn't saying that. But she suddenly realized that she felt so odd because she looked at the world differently. She would just get these flashes and insights, right, that nobody else had in the situation, and that often, like, the teacher didn't know where it came from. Right. But now she could feel really good about that. Yeah. So we'll talk about that. In that case, I might do a little bit more explaining up front, as far as, I mean, once the students identified, or the parents have identified what the gifts are, I might do a little bit more explaining about what that gift is and how it shows up and why it can be in conflict with school, just to give them a little bit of context. Right. But then we'll really get into how they use it, how they like to use it, where it shows up in their lives, and they will begin to articulate, where it is not understood in school, how it is not valued in school. But now they're valuing it. They have a way to talk about it. They have a way to feel good about it. And they no longer feel bad that they don't follow things in that sequential, logical way that the teacher's asking them to, that they just get this flash or whatever it might be.
Right. And you mentioned using VIA in teams?
Yes. So, for example, if when I'm doing an offsite, let's say with an executive group, so that's something where they might be running, say, a 3-day meeting, and they've got specific topics that they're trying to cover in that meeting, but I'm helping plan the meeting and I'm facilitating the meeting, thinking a lot about how do we build positive emotion in this meeting, how do we build trust, how do we build commitment, how do we build engagement. I'm thinking about those kinds of questions, and of course I'll talk with the person scheduling, that's the executive whose meeting it is. I don't just go off and do these things on my own. But for example, I might use the VIA as a way of having the team connect with each other in a new way. One way that I've used it, I've used it a lot of different ways, but for example, one way that I've used it is each executive around the room identifies their top 5 strengths. And then I've actually had the strengths up on the board around the room, and they put little Post-its up with their initials. So we now have sort of a map of the organization. Where does the organization have a lot of strengths?
Yeah.
Where does the organization, maybe curiosity. This organization only has a couple people with curiosity.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of things then to talk about. We can talk about where the organization has a lot of strengths. Let's say they have a lot of creativity.
Yeah.
Well, we can talk about how that shows up, why that is, different ways people are bringing creativity. Or we can also use it at the individual level. So we can kind of go back and forth from individuals to organization, but we can look at it at the individual level. And so, first of all, when I'm listening to you describe your strengths, that's uplifting for me, right there.
Yeah,
just that in and of itself.
Yeah.
Then, as a facilitator, I will say, well, okay, so Ebby says that he has persistence as a strength, diligence as a strength.
Yeah.
Do any of you see that in him? Around the room, people will be going, yeah. I say, anybody care to share an example? One of Ebby's colleagues will say, oh, well, I can remember when Ebby did X, Y, Z, and I really just saw you. You were so diligent about that. And so we create this bond and trust.
Yeah.
So that's sort of a combination of the individual and the organization. There's a lot of different ways I end up using it.
Okay. What about interventions? Do you use positive interventions or other interventions?
Well, first of all, I hate that word, intervention. I don't know why we have that word. To me, it's like, okay, I'm going to go stick something in here and muck around with it. Like,
what do you call
I just
it?
don't get it. Well, I mean, I do use the approach. I call them approaches, maybe, or tools. But anyway, so I just don't like the word intervention, and I don't think of it in those terms. I think of it more as skills. So say if you're my client, then I think about what might be a useful tool or a useful skill for you in this circumstance.
Right.
And so yes, I do use some of the positive approaches. Of course, 3 Good Things is one of my all-time favorites.
Right.
Because it's just so simple. Yet most of us don't do it most of the time.
No.
And it's one where I'm simply asking them to take note of what's good in their day. So for example, people kind of give positive thinking a bad name. And I've given that some thought because I think, why do they give that a bad name? And then I realized, well, if you're telling somebody, say this mantra, or, just tell yourself, you're the be-all and end-all. Well, that can feel pretty empty when you're not feeling like you're the be-all and end-all. But if I'm saying to you, look at 3 good things in your day, and if you're extremely anxious or you're depressed, I'll say to you, if you brushed your teeth today, you consider that a good thing. Because some people need that level of, it could be the most basic thing, and you take it as a good thing. The sun's out today. Okay, that's a good thing, right? And so, but that's them reaching inside themselves to articulate it. So it's a very simple, very easy to use. A lot of people write it down. Yeah. I have some clients who don't want to write things down, but they do it in their head.
Right.
And it shifts their energy. So that's, and I use lots of the tools and approaches that way.
Okay, can you say more about how you use them?
Well, let's see. Okay, so I've talked about strengths.
Yeah.
I use strengths in a lot of different ways. And of course, I use the gifts that I've identified as well. Another tool that I considered a positive psychology tool, that's not on that list of interventions. Let's see what else. I will use best future self, but I use it but what I'll do is I have a few different ways I use it. So I might take somebody's strengths and gifts, especially if I'm meeting somebody face to face, and I'll give them little pieces of paper or little index cards and with their strengths and gifts, and I'll say, okay. Now, usually I do this after we've been working together for a bit. I don't necessarily do this right up front. Because this can be something that takes a bit of skill. Not skill. A bit of positive emotion, a bit of willingness to go out there and do it. I guess that's what I mean by skill. But I'll say to them, tell me a story about yourself 5 years from now. Well, depending on the age of the person. If it's somebody, I could say to an adult 10 years from now, and that might be a better time frame for them. But for a lot of younger people, 5 years is about as much as they can go out. And I'll say, imagine everything you could possibly want has happened already. Now, talk to me about how you're using your different gifts and strengths. How are those showing up for you, or how did those help you to get there? So that's one example, because that makes it a little bit more concrete for them, and it also gets them thinking about their gifts and strengths in a different way. There are people who are willing to go home and write it out as an exercise, but as I said, a lot of clients I have don't want homework or just don't want to write things down, but they're very willing to do it together.
Right,
and
right.
I know the thinking is that it's better if they go home and do homework, that they're using it on their own. I don't completely subscribe to that, because what I feel is happening is, I feel like in a session, they are activating things in themselves and new neural pathways and new channels and new energy. And I'll give them things on cards. I'll give them written things to take home with them so that they can remember. But I don't necessarily feel like they do any better because they sat down and wrote by themselves for 5 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever it is, than if we talked about it one-on-one.
Right.
And that also, if you want, I can also expand on that for a second.
Yeah.
It just reminded me as I was saying that to you that another thing that I think about is, as a younger person, I didn't like to write things myself. Now I do. I mean, I'd much rather sit down and write my 3 good things than just think about it in my head. But when I was younger, I didn't want to. And I have plenty of adults, busy executives who don't want to be sitting doing that. They want these exercises for what they do for them, but they're not like positive psychologists who think that these things are actually fun to do. No. And so what I realized is, not everybody likes to sit down and write. Not everybody likes to be introspective. No. So again, I temper it based on the person. Right. But that's another.
And how do you do that?
Well, I will say to them, if you want, one thing you could do this week, and they'll pretty quickly tell me if it's something they want to do or they don't want to do. Right. And they usually like the idea of it. They just don't necessarily want to sit down and do it. Sometimes they might say, yeah, I'll try that this week, and then they come back next week and they haven't done it. So then I realized, okay, that's not for this person. Right. We'll just do it in the session together when it's appropriate.
Right. Okay. And can you mention some of the other exercises you do, activities or approaches?
Well, see, I weave in a lot. So it's not all straight like positive out of the positive psychology list of interventions. Let me just think off the top of my head. I mean, because I have a lot of other positive approaches and skills that I use. I mean, one thing I do use is I use a lot of the resilience tools from Karen Rivich and Marty Seligman and originally Aaron Beck. Yeah. Okay, so I've been trained in that, and I find those tools, part of it is optimism and learning to think with an optimistic explanatory style. Yeah. But there's also other kinds of resilience tools that are basically thinking tools. So I'll use those. Yeah. I use things from, I just listen and read to so many different pieces, and I've done it for so many years that I can't even tell you where I get all of it. Right. But so I bring in a lot of different pieces. Just trying to think off the top of my head of what other positive psychology things per se. I do a different take on some of them. For example, there's the gratitude exercises. Personally, I don't love the gratitude letter. I know what the research is on it. That's great. Just doesn't ring my bells. Depending on the client, I might find that it's appropriate. I haven't yet, but I might feel like it's something that a client would be open to, and I would certainly give it to them then. But I think about appreciation. What do you appreciate? And so I'll do some takes on that. Instead of gratitude, just a slightly different word. And appreciation of beauty and excellence is a word in psychology. But I'll think a lot about, what do you appreciate in your life? And so that might be something that I'll... in fact, I have one client now who was talking the other day about lists. And this is someone who has been quite significantly depressed. Yeah. And then... now is in a slightly better place, but still not feeling back to herself. And so she was talking about how when she feels a little bit better, she'll start getting all this energy, and she loves to write lists. Yeah. But then she said she'll just become exhausted again and kind of get depressed. Right. And I realized that what's going on for someone like that is that they get into the shoulds. They get all this energy going, right? So they start feeling good, they get this energy going, and then they get into the shoulds. Right. And the shoulds just overwhelm them. Yeah. So she said, but I love to write lists. And so she said, that's who I am. And so I said, well, how about just trying the next time, in the next week or two, when you get that kind of energy, why don't you make lists of everything you appreciate in your life right now?
Yeah.
Just that. Instead of lists of what I should do
Yeah.
or what I could do that end up making you tired,
Yeah.
what about that? So she's trying that right now. So that's an example, but I'll use appreciation in ways like that.
Right, right.
And I got that from somebody named Abraham Hicks, which is, so it's not straight out of positive psychology, but it's very related to
Yeah,
positive
it sounds like the Count Your Blessings kind of list.
Yes, stated a little differently and thought about a little differently, because count my blessings is like I'm so blessed with this versus like, hey, I appreciate Abby being here today, right? It's a little lighter, I'd say, maybe.
Yeah.
And both are good. Both are good.
And when do you know what to use? Like, you have all this huge toolbox and experience. How do you know what to take up from your toolbox and now to use it?
Well, it's not, I wouldn't say that at any given moment I say this is exactly the right tool for this moment and I know for sure that it is. It's more that in the moment I have ideas of what might be useful to this person, and I know where we've been. I know what this person's journey has been till now, and I know where they're trying to go. So I'll just be thinking a little bit about what could be useful to them. And a lot of times I'm thinking, what sort of skills, what pathways, what mental models am I trying to help them to create? And by the way, when I give somebody something, I'll sometimes say to them, let's try this, and if this is, if you find this is helpful, we'll do it, and if not, and usually, I'd say I'm not even sure that I ever have a time when it doesn't work, but I often give them that out, because I'm not always 100% sure that person's going to respond well to this approach at this moment in time.
No.
So I'll preface it that way. I'll think it might be something that would be helpful to them, but not know it at that moment. And but as I said, I can't even think of an example where they said, no, that didn't work for me.
No.
So it's not, I don't feel scientifically that I can say, oh, I know this is exactly the right tool to use at this point in time, but I do feel that I have a really good sense of where somebody is.
Yeah.
And so if it's a very busy executive talking about the dynamics in their organization, I'm going to think about what I'm offering to them in that situation a lot differently than if it's an anxious 8th grader.
Yeah. Right. And knowledge sharing. Can you say something about that? Do you like, sometimes you said you don't teach, but then you might share something. You mentioned that before.
Yeah. So I think there is a piece of teaching in it. I just think of it as co-creating with the client, and so I know some coaches feel that you only ask questions. That's not my model, because that's not how I like to be coached, and I do get coached, by the way. I've had coaches myself over the years. And first, starting with executives, I found that I had experience and knowledge that could be really helpful to that person in that moment, which wasn't for me to say that person wasn't perfectly capable of figuring things out for themselves. But if someone's been through it and has some ideas for you that could be useful, why not?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I would just offer it that way. I'd say, well, you could try doing this, or a lot of reframing, right? And so I guess maybe that's not quite answering where you were coming from in terms of the theory and the knowledge, but I offer it in small doses. So let me see if I can think of an example. Well, okay, let's take a really simple example. So strengths.
Yeah.
So when we first look at their strengths, I'll just say to them, okay, and again, it depends on whether it's a group or an individual, but I'll explain to them that these have been researched by Marty and Chris, and that, every major world religion and every major country, and 24 things that we generally value about people. So I'll give them that.
Yeah.
Because then, as they go to use this, it's not like, well, what is this thing? It's like, okay, this is validated.
Yeah.
With the gifts, I'll do the same thing. I'll explain to them that I did this research and that this is how I identify these gifts. So right up front, I give them maybe a little bit like that. Now, after they've looked at their strengths, we've talked about them a little bit, or their gifts, and we talked about them a little bit, and I'll draw them out in terms of how they use them, how they see them showing up, how they like to use them. I may right then, or I might later in the conversation, or I might in another session say to them, well, one of the things that we know from positive psychology is that if you can use your strengths in new ways, that creates what we call engagement.
Yeah.
That sense of losing a sense of time, being in flow. So I'll say something like that, for example. That's about as much as I might teach.
Right.
Or as I said to you with the myths of education, I might say to a student, I had a student who said, she thought her parents really wanted her to get good grades and that they would be very upset, let's say with a C, for example. And then I did a session separately with her mother. The girl had wanted that, and I often do that, by the way, when I'm working with students. And so I did it with the mother, and in the end, the mother ended up saying, what I want more than anything is that my daughter know her gifts and strengths, feel good about herself, be on a path to being fulfilled in life, right? So that's really what parents deep down want. We just sometimes think that the way to get there is through A's. So the next session I was with the daughter, she again says her parents, are putting pressure on her about these grades. And I said, well, that's interesting because, when I was talking with your mother last week, I didn't get that sense from her. I got the sense that and so the daughter backed off and she said, well, yeah, I feel like she's starting to shift. And she said, my dad's okay about it. She said, but, my teacher. So then I said, well, what about your teacher? And what would your teacher think? What would you be saying to yourself? Or what would your teacher think of you if you got a C in science, for example? And she said, well, she'd think I was dumb. So then in that case, okay, so I've had a conversation with her. She's the one bringing this to the table. Yeah. But now I'll say to her, well, you probably don't know about the research I've done before you came here. Usually, if it's a kid, they don't. The parents often do, but the kids don't. And so I'll say to her, well, do you know, and I'll start to explain one of the myths about education. So I might take a minute, two at the most.
Right.
Explain that. So that's, I guess, the way I do any teaching or explaining. I'll use it as a way of kind of shifting their perspective, or maybe validating something if it needs to be, if it's just useful to them that it's validated.
Yeah. Right. And are there certain points in the conversation where you would do that, like certain times, or like when you do it?
When it hits me in the moment. When it seems like in that moment it's something that could be helpful to them.
Right. Okay.
Sorry, I don't think that was very satisfying.
Oh, no. What about, I have some questions about some other things that might influence the outcome of a session. Like the expectations that they show up with might influence. So do you do something to create credibility for you, or the way that you work, or something like that?
I don't do anything deliberately to do that. I mean, as I said, I might talk about, when I'm going to give them an assessment, I'll tell them where it came from to give it a little bit of credibility. I think when they hire me, they think I have credibility, or they wouldn't be coming to me. Right. So I guess, I'm trying to think if I don't think that's ever been an issue for me.
Right. And what do you do to establish a good relationship with them?
Well, I think it just happens pretty naturally. I think, again, I don't think it's something I really think like, okay, I'm going to go establish a good relationship. It's more like I'm interested in them. I think it kind of happens naturally. I mean, you have the sort of warm up conversation, getting to know them a little bit. As you're going through the session, you're really getting to know them. And I guess one thing I would say, I know you're going to, sorry, I'm going to preempt a question that I know is coming later. We'll still come back to it. But I think in coaching, it just seems to me that, at least this is my experience for myself, and it's the experience I see. I have a few good friends, colleagues who've become good friends who are coaches. And as I said, I've hired coaches for myself. Yeah. And what I see pretty consistently with people I consider to be terrific coaches is that they love it. It's just kind of like a natural part of who they are. Yeah. So when I say that, then I say for myself, when I start talking with somebody and start getting to know them, I just kind of love that person. Yeah. Like it just happens. Yeah. So I think you just build kind of a natural bond because of that.
Yeah.
That's what it seems like to me.
And so when you do coaching, like if one thing would be to look at the techniques, the things that you do, and the other thing would be to look at how you do it. Like, so how can you put some words on how do you do it? Like,
well, one thing I do before I go into a coaching session, I usually try to, I mean, even if, you know, I'm racing from one person to the next or whatever, even while like the phone is ringing, or if I'm sitting there waiting for the phone to ring, I do a really, and usually I try to take more than 10 seconds. I mean, normally I try to take 30 seconds, a minute at least. Or sometimes I'll even do it in the morning, knowing that I have, you know, several people or several meetings and clients in between. But I try to quiet my mind and focus on that person. And I actually will just think sort of lovingly about that person and sort of set an intention about the fact that, you know, we'll have a beautiful connection in that session. So I'll do it before we go into a session at that level, but other than that, I'm sorry, I forgot.
So it's about the relationship. So some people, the way that they try to describe it is that the relationship in coaching is very, or at least in psychotherapy, is like very tied into how you deliver things. So you can't really do research. Well, you can do research on the interventions and you can do research on the relationship, but in practice it's kind of woven together. So the techniques and models would be what you do, and the relationship would be how you do it. And so just to get some more words, so that's why I'm trying to ask that question.
Okay, so your question reminds me of something. This may or may not be useful, but when I was in my earlier days as a consultant, actually I ran a nonprofit that was a consortium of businesses for a couple of years. And so what we had was, I ran the Northeast, and so we had like 40 companies that were involved. And so I was working with all these executive teams. And we had actually like models and tools and training programs that we could take people through. And something dawned on me one day. It's not really that big an insight, but I'll just share it anyway because I think it's valid in this case as well. It dawned on me. Some people need a model that tells them, like we had a model and a whole course on things like how to build good interrelationships and trust and, you know, manage a team. Some people like that step-by-step model and they follow it and it works for them. It doesn't come naturally per se, but they can follow the model and it works really well. Other executives would look at us like, you know, you got two heads. Like, doesn't everybody know how to do that? It doesn't even have to be executives. I've seen 25-year-olds for whom it came so naturally. They didn't need that step-by-step model because they did the pieces of it, but they just did it organically.
Right.
That's what I think too about coaching. And for me, coaching is one of those organic things. I do so much work, and I have for, I didn't even know. I mean, one day, an HR VP said to me, wow, you know, you do so much self-development. I didn't know it was called that. I didn't know I was doing it. It was a hobby. It was a hobby. I read all this stuff like that a lot of people wouldn't want to bother to read. And I would try it all on myself. And I tried it in like situations that I was in before I ever began coaching. So I don't think I can talk about the what and the how. Because it's too blended. I don't even think of it in those terms. I think of it as I'm a resource to you, but I benefit from the relationship too. I mean, that's the thing about coaching. Like, I come out of coaching sessions high. Like, I feel so, like, I'm so happy. Because, like, I love the person I'm coaching, or at least I love things about them. And so I look at it as this thing where I'm a resource to you, but you're also, I also benefit from helping you. And I look at it as I'm sharing things in whatever way I can that are useful to you, that you are gonna then use to take you to the next level. But you might have things that add to that and take it beyond that. So it's not all coming from me or even from my questions.
And so what would you say, you've been experienced people coaching you also, so you must have an idea of what's good coaching and what's maybe less good. So what would you say? What makes it good when it's good?
Okay, I think well, there's different kinds of good coaches, and different coaches have been right for me at different times.
Right.
The one thing I would say is that for me, a good coach isn't somebody who has the tools and takes me through them, because that's way too much process for me. And I actually, once when I was first thinking about being coached, I actually, tested out someone who did that with me.
Right.
And she said to me, wow, you've thought so much about these things before. Well, I had, because I just think about these things. So she was prepared with the tools and the questions, but she wasn't yet skilled and she wasn't yet as experienced, you know what I mean? And so for me, now for somebody else, that might be exactly where they want to start if they haven't done this, this kind of thinking for themselves. But for me, it's somebody who's got a lot of just experience of some kind themselves, and I've had very young coaches, so when I say that, that's not an age thing. Usually, well, it's different things. They may have, I had a coach for a while who, really knew meditation in a lot of different ways, and coached as well, but what I originally initially hired her for was the fact that she was so advanced and skilled in this meditation, and I really wanted to learn more about that. Another coach has questions and tools that aren't things that I was familiar with. Those are good, but they're just really good as prompts for me. What's great about her is that she just has insight, and she'll just say to me, I'm kind of getting some things here. Can I share these with you? And she'll have these insights that are really useful to me.
Right, yeah.
So that's a good coach for me. But I think a good coach depends on you. Yeah. Like if you're somebody who, when I was talking about the people who want to go through things step by step, if you prefer that, methodical process, or if you're somebody who doesn't give a lot of thought to the kinds of questions you raise in coaching, you might want a really different coach than someone who does.
Right.
I don't know.
Last question. About client engagement, you mentioned before some clients don't like to do homework. So what do you do to help the clients stay engaged in the process of working towards their goals?
Well, I think it happens pretty naturally. So for example, if it's let's go to executives for a moment. So a lot of times executives are talking to me about dynamics going on in their organizations and their own role in it, or of course it also will end up being personal too, because we're people, we're not just like the organization person, we've got other parts of our lives. But we'll usually talk about situations that were not simply yesterday, but they're going to be going on next week, or at least you're going to be dealing with those people next week. So what we will be talking about is looking at the situation in different ways. They might pick up some new skills based on what we're talking about. They may simply think about some new conversations based on what we're talking about. But generally, they will be feeling calmer about whatever it is. They'll be feeling better about themselves, depending on how we got there. And so we might talk about, well, you might have this conversation with that person next time. Or what might you say next week to that person? So we might play out some things that they're going to do in the week ahead, or I should say weeks ahead, because we're not necessarily always meeting every week. Or I might give them something to think about. But what I feel, and I see it because I see the shift in them over time, is I think that as we talk in a session, they shift.
Yeah.
Their energy changes, their thoughts change, their feelings change. Sometimes we all revert back a little bit. So you go forward a little bit, maybe go back a little bit. But in general, the momentum is into a new direction. And so I feel like the shift continues. As I said, they may shift back a little bit, but the fact that I give them a homework assignment or don't, I don't think that, I haven't seen that the people who do a homework assignment shift back any less than the people who don't. Right. I think the change is sparked by the fact that they even came, called, whatever, that they even signed up
Yeah.
to talk with me, that they even raised the question or the situation, that
Yeah.
they explored it in new ways.
Yeah.
All of that, I think, starts them on
Yeah. Yeah.
some change. And it might be quieter and subtler in the beginning, but and I think, with the positive approaches, one of the things that happens in any session is that they are building a lot of positive energy,
Yeah.
and they're building
Yeah.
positive resources.
Yeah.
And that, I think, creates shift that carries forward,
Right.
regardless of, whether they do their homework or something.
Yeah. Can you say something about the relationship?
Yeah, so one of the things that strikes me about a good relationship is when you feel someone really cares about you, and when you feel, I'll call it known, like that I get who you are, and that I think who you are is really a terrific person, you can feel whether that's authentic.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
You know whether that's authentic. And I think when you feel that from someone who you view as competent in what they're doing, then that creates a phenomenal relationship. And I think that happens in coaching is because, as you get to know someone, as I get to know someone, I just think legitimately, like, that I marvel at like how amazing they are as I get to know them. And I think they feel that.
Yeah.
And I think that they respond to that, and I think that builds the relationship too.
Right. What's the feedback you get from clients? What do they tell you is most helpful to them?
Well, actually, what I just said, I didn't know that in the early days. I didn't know that when I relate to someone and get to know them, I didn't realize that it was, I never thought about it. I never articulated that I see what's amazing about them and feel that they're really wonderful and special and love them in that way. And so it was actually originally clients who gave me that feedback.
Right.
That I made them feel that way. And then other people also gave me that feedback. And so all of a sudden I realized, oh, yeah, sure, of course I do that, but I hadn't realized it until somebody articulated it for me.
Right. And what else? What do clients mention? Other things that they mention is really helpful in a coaching with positive psychology?
They, sometimes I have fun with clients. We laugh. We have a good time. Again, it really depends on where they're willing to go.
Yeah.
And so they'll enjoy, because I'll bring things that take them into a place where I'll say to them, well, I don't know if this is going to be comfortable for you, and we'll go there, and then, they'll enjoy it. And, but I think I get more general feedback from people, just that this is really helpful. I feel so much better about myself. I feel so much more confident. With executives, they'll get promotions.
Right.
They'll get on new responsibility, or they'll say, my people are responding so much better. So, there'll just be things that, indicators like that. But I'm not sure that they tell me anything super specific beyond that.
Right. And how do you find out that they're progressing? Like the promotions and what they tell you, is that the way, or?
Yeah, I can see it. I can see it in the sessions. I can see the shift in their thinking. I can see the shift in the way they talk about themselves. I can see sometimes that they're happier. The way they might be talking about the job or the organization. Yes, they might get promoted. I mean, that's we certainly don't start out with coaching to say that you're doing this to get promoted, because there's no guarantee at all that that's going to happen. But things like that do happen.
Right.
But they're just good events will happen. I mean, if it's, say it's an executive that works for the CEO, then they might come to me the next time and say, the CEO said this, or we had this conversation, and it's so different from where they were 2 months before.
Right.
Or if it's a CEO, he might come back to me, or she might come back and say, this happened with this person, and it's like completely different from, say they were really irritated with this person, say, and now, this person has been responding in a whole new way and kind of stepping up to the plate in a whole new way. Things like that. But a lot of what the sense I get of whether they're progressing is whether they seem happier, whether they seem calmer, more relaxed. They'll tell me. I mean, they'll tell me that they're feeling better, or that this is doing them a world of good. Sometimes, as I said, on the executive side, it can get into the personal side, and they'll come back and tell me, my relationship's so much better. So that. So yeah, that's how I gauge it.
Right. And what do you think causes the changes that you see?
Well, I think, as I said, I think they come into this with me because they want to create something new in their life.
Yeah.
And they aren't sure alone how they want to create that shift. So they want to do it together.
Yeah.
With somebody. And I think that together we come up with new mental models, we come up with positive energy, new ways of seeing themselves, new ways of seeing their situations, new tactics that they can use, like new things that they can say in different situations. So there's a lot of different pieces, and they may, I'm not just giving this to them, I may be asking them and they may be coming up with it, but then that's just in the session. They leave our session, and that stuff is still in some way, shape, or form. It might be percolating way back in the deep recesses of their mind, or it may be front and center, depending if it's the type of person that likes to think about these things. But in some way, it's continuing with them a little bit. And I think that's how it seems to me that the changes take place. I did write a paper when I was in positive psychology about this very topic, about not for coaching per se, but just how positive change occurs, because I think of things in systems, and that's just my training, my background. And so if you think of a system, how a positive change in one small part of the system, and if you think of that as a person, like I could be a system, or you could be a system, one small change, positive change in a part of your system might end up impacting lots of other parts of your system.
Right. And how do you develop as a professional?
I just have a lot of interest in the whole personal development, human, well-being, growth, so one way that I develop actually is I do a lot of meditating myself.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, that I feel like that's a development tool. It's not knowledge per se, but it actually does sort of open me to new knowledge in certain ways, and it opens me to different ways of operating with people and operating in the world. I also I formed a group with a group of colleagues who are either coaches, executive coaches, speakers, etc., but all out of positive psychology, and we have a weekly call.
Yeah.
So we not only do mentoring and feedback for each other, but we also share new knowledge and tools and things. And then I read pretty widely. I go to some conferences, and but I'm not trying to stay up strictly with positive psychology. For me, positive psychology is a phenomenal new area, but there's pieces outside of what's strictly defined as positive psychology that I think are valuable.
Right. And when you learn something new, how do you integrate it in the way that you already work?
Well, it depends. I don't simply learn something new and say, okay, let me put this in here. It's more, as I'm learning it, I might be thinking either how I apply it to myself.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot of what I do, is I will learn new things and I will apply them to myself first.
Yeah.
And if it's something that seems to work really well for me, then I will start to introduce it to other people. For example, I might introduce it to people on my call, colleagues on my call. Or if I'm in a situation with a coaching client and it seems like it could be something that's appropriate, I'll say to them, this is something I've been using a bit myself and it seems to be pretty valuable. Is it something you might want to try? And if they're open to it, then I'll share it with them.
Right.
Yeah. So, but I'd say the first place that I bring in new things is trying it for myself.
Right. And what about positive psychology coaching? Would you say that? What would you say about that? Like the term and.
Well, I think I'm not quite. I like the term positive psychology. I like the idea that using positive approaches in coaching is like an unbelievably valuable thing. And I do think, somebody who's got a lot of experience in using them, applying them, has studied in school, I think being able to say that someone's done that tells you that they've got a level of kind of more than knowledge, more experiential, that's valuable. I just don't know the term. Like, I don't call myself a positive psychology coach. That's just not who I am. But I am I don't even call myself a coach. Actually, I'm a mentor. I think of it that way.
Right.
And when I think of it that way, I think of it as helping people create positive change.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of been what I've been about, and that I didn't decide that that would be what I was about. It's sort of, that's just how my career has evolved.
Right.
So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but
So would you say that using positive psychology in coaching is different from other ways of coaching?
Yes, it definitely is in my experience, and my experience with other ways of coaching is pretty limited because it's limited to the coaches that I've had myself or that I've talked to myself. But yeah, I would say it definitely is, because I think there are a lot of mental models in the world that are based on more on therapy. Now, coaching isn't therapy, of course, but I think some of the kinds of things, and they might be based on therapy, they might also be based on some really good Eastern philosophies and things like that. And I think those are all fantastic. The issue that I think is where it can be different is that it's not based on creating positive energy and thinking from that point of view.
No.
And I really think personally that if you haven't done it for yourself, then it's more preaching than it is mentoring.
Right.
But if you've done it for yourself and you've experienced it for yourself, then I think that it's really valuable in coaching. And I think all of them can be valuable, you know, as we said earlier, depending on the client.
Yeah.
Maybe a different type of coaching is more appropriate for that person.
Right. And are there things we've not talked about that are important to understand the way that you work?
I think you've really hit on pretty much everything. I did start to talk a little bit about systems, and I do think a little bit about systems. I don't bring that in a lot with a person, but we do know with a system that when you make a change in one part of the system, you affect every other part of the system. And for example, you can make a positive change in one part of a system. That's good for a while. It starts to create some positive change. But let's say it's a family system. Let's say it's an organizational system. You can have a backlash, right? Because the system wants to go back into its old balance.
Yeah.
And so I do think about that. I just use that, if I'm working with an individual, I use that simply as background. I may use that to help them think a little bit about going forward, what might be some reactions and how they might handle themselves in that situation. I might also use it to help them understand a situation that's come about and they're now here talking to me about it.
Yeah.
You know, something like that. But I'd say that's maybe the other piece that I think about.
Right. And what if I get to talk to a few other coaches also, what information from them would you like? Like what would be interesting for you to know?
I'd say I'd like to know maybe just what do they find most effective in their coaching, and what do they love most in their coaching. I'd be interested to hear that. And if they have observations on types of clients they work best with or don't work best with, or anything about like tailoring it, customizing more to clients, be interested in hearing other people's experiences on that.
Right. And what advice would you give to other people who would like to do positive psychology and coaching? And
well, I prefer not to give advice unless I'm asked for advice.
Right,
I'll start right there. But let's just assume that somebody is asking. I'd say do it for yourself. So if you can't go to the positive psychology program at Penn, or there's one in the UK, if you can't go to one of those, then get out and practice. I mean, as I said to you, I was doing, in fact, when I wrote my application, I said I've been doing positive psychology with a small p, not the official science, but I had basically been studying positive approaches and using them for myself and my work years and years and years. I mean, probably 10 or 15 years before positive psychology even existed.
Yeah.
So you can do that for yourself, even if you're not in the quote unquote official field of it. And that's what I would say. I would say start there. Start, you know, if it's of interest to you, then start learning about it and start applying it to yourself.
Yeah.
And then when you've applied things with yourself and you see what seems to work well and what doesn't work as well, maybe then start, as you're talking with friends or family members who come to you with issues, maybe test it out on them or something like that. And then I'd also say, if you're somebody who seems to love that, working with other people to help them get where they want to go and co-creating with them in that way, then that's an ideal thing for you, and just get started, because what will happen is it'll happen naturally. I mean, you could go to a coaching program, but you don't have to. If you, I mean, again, this is my approach, but if you start using these things for yourself, if you find that you are being sought out by friends and family to talk through things, if they start telling you and telling other people that you're really helpful and that they feel a lot better after they talk to you, and that things that they tried that you know, came up with them, or questions that you asked them prompted them to think about something differently, if all of that starts to happen, people are going to start coming knocking on your door, asking you to coach them. And you can just get started.
And you mentioned before that you're writing a book. Does that book have some advice or messages for people that would be relevant in the positive psychology coaching context?
It definitely does. So the book I'm writing is about my research on adolescence. It's basically about, you know, getting beyond the myths of education and unleashing the hidden talents in every young adult. And so that's looking at what are these hidden gifts that I mentioned to you that I realized are actually in conflict with what school's asking of students. And that's for students, well, it came out of students in the bottom 80%. What I realized is that they are perfectly suited to the future economy and to being unbelievably successful in life, if we can just get out of their way and see, and that they see what's good in them. But beyond that, other students, even top students, suffer from anxiety and depression. And it's because of the way we've structured our system as a society, and that gets a little bit complex. But the book will be talking about that and talking about the myths. And then it'll get into, so what do you do instead? And it'll be talking about all sorts of different ways of helping to de-stress, helping to create positive energy, engage. And I think that would be relevant to some positive psychology coaches.